Thanks, Ayel Rusa, and hard questions by Alice. I hope you got a better understanding there of the black art, as we like to call it, of influence and influencers. Okay, we're halfway there. Can I just call up that poll again, because it's interesting to see what's coming up. This is a poll we asked earlier about what's important, some of the themes of this morning, and all that good soft stuff is still up there. Not surprising, considering what we've been talking about. So people think that happy customers and happiness in general is far more important than data and reputation, interestingly enough. So there's a bit of a change of gear now, because all that marketing stuff is great, but in the end of the day, this is serious business, and innovation, creativity are actually at the core of what we do. So for the rest of the morning, we're going to talk a little bit about that. And we've got some world-class senior executives from the industry to bring you through a couple of examples and some serious content here. Okay, so the next session, returning to the Web Summit and very much focused on problem solving and innovation. Can you give a warm welcome to Gail Heimann, who is president of the Great Weber Shandwick. Thank you.
Hey, good afternoon. It seems like there's been a lot of talk about happiness and some amusing videos on the stage so far this morning. But now I'm going to talk about problem solving. And what we're going to do is we're going to do a very short historical romp through problem solving. And then we're going to talk about how each of us can solve problems, be they business problems or be they societal problems. But first, this guy.
Son, I got 99 problems. Ain't one. Hit me.
Okay, so you're probably familiar with him. That's Jay-Z. You're familiar with his oeuvre and that of his wife, Beyonce. 99 Problems, as it turns out, really isn't so bad. The world is filled with problems. Here's just 17 that the United Nations has identified. And these are massive, huge problems: poverty, health, inequality. And there are many more. But as all of you likely know, right, problems have been around for a very long time. Here's a guy named Moses. You may remember a biblical story. He had a problem. He was taking all these slaves out of Egypt. He got to the Red Sea. He couldn't cross. What he did was he lifted his staff, and apparently the Red Sea parted. Interestingly, if you look back into it, biblical historians say this never actually happened, though there maybe was an earthquake somewhere around that time. But bottom line, problems, not a new thing. Solutions, also not a new thing. Here, right around the same time and the same place, there was a problem, right? Stagnant water, rotting barley, enter beer, right? So beer was created 6,000 years ago as a problem, and it's had a phenomenal history ever since. Okay, so now we think, all right, we have always needed, and we've always had, ta-da, problem solvers. But who are they, who were they, and who will they be? So let's just take a quick look. We're going to go back in time. You probably don't talk about this guy too often. Somewhere around the mid-1st century, a guy named Aryabhata, and he was a mathematician and astronomer in India. Problem they had is they could never figure out the seasons, right? When is it going to rain? When is it going to not rain? What should we grow? What should not grow, right? And so what he did is he thought he had a theory, very early theory, and the theory was that the Earth rotated on an axis. Everybody else at the time said, no, the sky is revolving around the Earth. As it turns out, he was right. He ultimately developed a calendar, and that calendar was in use many hundreds of years after. Here's a guy with whom you probably are familiar. You can see here, and his name is Louis Braille. His problem, and it's a very serious problem, he was blinded at the age of 5. Actually, he was playing in his dad's leather studio with an awl, which is a long, pointy instrument, and he blinded himself. Ultimately, then, he went to school later on, and he felt that blind people were pitied and condescended to. And he talked about this gap between the sighted and the blind and what could do about it. Then he learned about something that was called by the French army night writing, right? And it was developed for the French army so that they could read and communicate in the night and in the dark and without speaking to each other. So he ultimately used that same awl that unfortunately he blinded himself with and developed Braille, which came into use, unfortunately, 2 years after his death. So here's another problem, and here's a guy, Sir Alexander Fleming. I have a Scottish husband, and he tells me the Scots have solved all the problems in the world, which I don't know if that's true or not. But at any rate, this guy, this is an accidental problem solved. He was working on cures for, solutions for bacterial infection, at that time a huge problem, and went on vacation, leaving a petri dish full of stuff in his lab, which apparently was notably messy. He came back from vacation and found this massive fungus growing on this petri dish. As it turns out, that fungus was killing other bacteria. He noticed that and said, aha, long story short, we have penicillin, which changed the world of infectious disease. So accidental problem solving can have a lot of impact. All right. One last, and this one sort of in the 1940s, 1950s in America, a woman named Marjorie Joyner. She was a hairstylist. She opened and ran hairstyling schools, and the problem was the waves in people's hair didn't last long enough. So she was cooking some piece of meat and used some heated coil in the meat, and it did really well for the meat. She thought maybe this could be helpful for the waves in people's hair, and it turned out to be, but it burnt their scalp when it did. So she developed she developed an approach to waves, and then she developed a solution for the burnt scalp, and became the first the African-American woman to get a patent in the United States. So all right, now we fast forward to today, right? There are people who solve problems every day, life and death problems. Most of our problems aren't really life and death, but for physicians, they are. So talk to this guy. He's a pediatric neurologist in New York, and here's how he approaches those kinds of problems.
Problem solving is an art, and basically you have to balance out what information you've gathered, how you evaluate that information, and then look at the whole picture and bring it all together. And not be afraid to step back after you make your first opinion, to do it again, and to look at it from a different angle and make another opinion. I think the biggest mistake problem solvers make is they think there is only one answer, and there's not necessarily one answer. And you need to look at all the different possibilities and bring that all together. And I think that's the art.
So I think that's an important point. There may not be one answer. Remember, we're going to talk about business problems, societal problems. There may not be one answer to those problems. All right, over to Bonin Bao. Bonin Bao transformed Pepsi digitally. He then went on to Mondelez, working on brands like Oreos, et cetera. And now he's a VC guy. He has an approach to problems.
My methodology for addressing the toughest problems are identify what the source of the problem is and then go around it.
And that, if any of you know, Bonin is very true to his approach. I think we might have lost the slideware here. Ah, we're back, okay. So Bonin's approach is to find the source of a problem and then simply go around it. And that has been true, and that has been effective for him over the last couple of years. There is a guy, Karl Popper, considered one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century, and he said, all of life is problem solving. And he has a scientific theory that says, you know what, you're not proving something is right, you're simply falsifying it and falsifying it again and again and again and again and again, meaning that you're constantly solving a problem, not proving a truth. So it's a very complex theory, which one could go on and on. But okay, so if all of life is problem solving, how do we all get it done? Go to this guy, you're probably familiar with him. He wrote a big book called Sapiens, now has a new book out called 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. What he wants to do is really tackle these massive societal problems, discuss these massive societal problems, and think about ways to tackle them, as he says here. So what is it that we, the collective we in this room, should be paying attention to? What should we teach our kids? He talks, and I think this is interesting, he talks a lot about these joint forces, right? That there's this diminution, this liberalism losing credibility, and you can see that in parts of Europe, and you can see it in Brazil, and you can see that in the United States at exactly the same time that information technologies and biotechnologies are rising, and he thinks that's something we've got to grapple with. His approach approach, I should say, if you get to the end of the book, is he says he meditates every day for a couple of hours. I just thought I'd throw that in. But one of the things he talks about that I think is quite interesting is this evolution of things that we have. So you go back to the Jurassic period, and our means of protecting ourselves were knives, right? Little flint knives. And that's gone on to become nuclear missiles. And those are infinitely more dangerous, more scary. But then you think about what's gone on in communications, right? So there were cave paintings, and that begat TV. And TV, as he says, makes it easier to delude people. But now we've got algorithms, right? And we're here in Lisbon, and we're talking a lot about algorithms. And think about what algorithms control. They control what I buy, because it's what pops up on my feed. They control where I go, because I'm using Google Maps. They control perhaps what I'm paid, because of the way they control the markets. And they may control who I date and marry if I'm using dating apps. So algorithms have a lot of control. And he says, ultimately, if we don't figure this out, it's going to be the algorithms that decide what we should know and what we do. And he feels, you know what, we've still got a few years. We can make a choice and figure it out, but we need to do it now. All right, and so we will do it and talk about how to do it from a marketing point of view. So I went over to Forbes magazine, and this stuff you hear about, and you can read it in sort of airplane business books, but how do the greatest leaders solve problems? And they're super transparent, right? They're transparent about the problems they're solving. They're transparent with those with whom they're solving problems. They are open-minded and surround themselves with open-minded people. They have a solid data-driven, and lots of talk about data, but data is hugely important, a solid data-driven foundational strategy, and they are silo breakers, right? So I believe that marketers are silo busters, excuse me, by nature. And the reality is, what we all need to do, and this is a little bit of algebra, is solve for X. But the path gets increasingly complicated. So what we did at my firm is we said, you know what? In the world of our clients, and we're a big marketing firm, they have a lot of problems. But what we're seeing is a key way to solve is using the business propellant skill sets of technology and data and innovation. So what we did is we put all those skill sets into the center of our organization and called it the X practice. So that was our way of de-siloing so we could better solve business problems. I believe that the key for us as individuals, right? So that's a way to solve for an organization. Key for us as individuals is to recognize that from now on we must be cerebrally ambidextrous, right? And know all the talk about, hey, someone's right brain and hey, someone's left brain. That is no longer the case. We can no longer go out into the business world, into the technology world, and think that way. We have to be cerebrally ambidextrous. I thought, okay, that's a big idea. Let me see what the neurologist has to say about that. And here he is.
Now, you might ask, is it the left brain or the right brain that puts this all together? But actually, your brain's a network. It's this constant looking at one thing, comparing it to something else, making a list, double-checking it, and that's how we sort of think. But you can't start thinking about something until you get clarity about what the actual issue is, and is that the symptom or the underlying problem, and differentiate that to help put the whole story together.
All right, so bottom line, in a networked world, your brain is a network, right? So you've got to think of it that way. So I believe that the solution to all these problems lies in that tension, and the tension that Harari and others have been talking about, and the tension we see here every day, right? The tension between data and creative, the tension between technology and humanity, huge issues. And it used to be man and the machine, but now the machine and womankind. So if we navigate that tension correctly, we, the collective we, can make a difference, right? So I just want to show you a couple of cases of that happening. This one is called The Trash Isles. It is a story that is born of data. We, the collective we, throw 8 billion tons of garbage into the ocean every year. Garbage, so much garbage in the ocean, it has formed an island the size of France. So here the approach was to recognize that the only way to get the countries around the world to help out and clean up this island is to designate it a country itself. So this group went about doing that.
In the Pacific Ocean, there is so much plastic, an area the size of France has formed. Governments have simply ignored it. So we found a way to ensure they couldn't. by turning the country-sized trash patch into an official country.
Les trash isles.
Trash isles.
A la isla de plástico. Des îles poubelles.
Introducing the trash isles. On World Oceans Day, the Plastic Oceans Foundation and LADBIBE submitted an application to the United Nations to recognise the trash isles as an official country, because under the laws of the UN, other countries are then obliged to clean it up.
Declared the part of the ocean where all the trash is gathered, the plastic, the trash isles. Has the petition been received, and what's your take on it?
I think it's a very innovative and creative way to bring attention to a problem that is often not seen.
Having met the criteria.
All right, in the interest of time, I'm going to go on to the next one. So different kind of comment, but that was a good example of going around, right? Thinking a little differently, going around to solve a very significant problem. All right, here's a very significant societal problem, right? And it's the cycle of poverty. And in this case, a cycle of sex workers who can get no other jobs to support themselves and their families. So here, this solvent, it's from Stay Free Femcare, happens to be in India. This is a problem, obviously, that is all around the world. The thought was, how do we break this cycle? Break this cycle of sex workers, break this cycle of poverty. And the thought was, and it's an interesting idea, most women in the world are not super happy to get their period. The only women in the world that are happy to get their period may be sex workers because they have 3 days off. So what can you do with those 3 days off to break the cycle for these women?
There is blood constantly.
I hate my period. It's a nightmare. It's the worst 3 days of the month. Don't argue with me on this.
Brought from rural areas and tricked into prostitution, India's commercial sex workers are exploited on a daily basis. Periods are the only days when they're not forced to work.
जो काम है ना हमारा हमेशा रहता है, जुकाम सर्दी 3 दिन पीरियड्स आता है, वही टाइम में हम लोग घर में आराम करते हैं. अच्छा लगता है, घर पे टाइम पास करता है, घर का काम धंधा करता है.
This is the story of how Stay Free, India's leading sanitary napkin brand, is helping women in the sex trade learn the skills of a new trade on their free period days. Introducing Project Free Period. India's leading anti-trafficking NGO Prerna and a team of expert trainers came together to create a unique curriculum. Designed to generate economic sustenance, the courses were condensed into easy 3-day modules.
So using those 3 days to educate those women in skills that could help them economically. I'm going to go through this, but this is another big problem, and that is gender equality. And here, this is Barbie, right? Can you really conquer gender equality with a doll? But a big issue in gender equality is for women to rise up, for women to gain truly half of the power they need to get into the economy. To get there, there is a saying, you know, you can't see it if you can't be it. So creating role models. And these guys have created a new line called Sheroes and Role Models that represent all girls. And this is a woman named Ibtihaj Muhammad, who was the first woman to compete in the Burqa Olympics. She medaled and ultimately became a Barbie doll. So we won't go through the video. Just to reflect on what we've heard, right? I mean, you heard Dr. Wolf say, you know, problem solving is an art, right? There could be more than one solution. We got to think about that. Bonham's thinking, you know, you got to find the source and go around it. And we saw examples of that in trash aisles and in free period. Communicating transparently is incredibly important. Breaking down silos, the biggest problems we have in society, breaking down the silos between the public and the private sector are exceedingly important, and always being open-minded. So one last word from him.
I got 99 problems, but ain't one. Hit me. Yeah, it's 90.
So takeaway for all of us, I think, whether we're in technology, whether in marketing, whatever we are doing, right? I think we have an enormous opportunity and also an enormous responsibility to use that cerebral ambidexterity and solve problems for business and solve problems for the world. So thanks very much.